I found something in a collection of Victorian-era blueprints that made me stop reading. And I need you to understand what it means, because the more I looked at it, the more other things started making sense in ways they shouldn't. It was a simple building, a school. Or that's what the archive called it. Built in 1847, somewhere in Eastern Europe, nothing remarkable about the exterior. But the interior specifications made me go back through everything 3 times, because what I was reading didn't match what schools were supposed to look like in 1847. The floor. Every classroom had a suspended wooden floor, not concrete, not packed earth, suspended, engineered joists underneath, creating air space. The specifications called for a resilient, shock-absorbing substructure. That exact phrase. Why would a room full of children sitting at desks learning arithmetic need a suspended, shock-absorbing floor? The load ratings for those joists. I pulled up period engineering manuals. The calculations, because yes, they included calculations, showed those floors were engineered to handle distributed loads of 800–900 pounds per 100 square feet. That's not static classroom weight. That's dynamic load. That's impact. That's something being repeatedly dropped, bounced, struck, driven against the surface. The wall attachments made it worse. Iron rings, dozens per classroom. Same pattern as your sample showed. Waist-high, chest-high overhead. Spaced 4 feet apart, load-bearing, rated for lateral force. The blueprints labeled them as conditioning apparatus anchor points. Conditioning apparatus, not decoration, not aesthetic ornament. The word was apparatus. A tool, a system for something. The ceiling. Double reinforced wooden beams, massive, engineered to support overhead loads that far exceeded the static weight of plaster and wood. The specifications included something marked apparatus rails, suggesting a track system that could be installed and removed. Modular, designed for multiple configurations. And there were window specifications that made me sit back in my chair. Full-length windows, floor to ceiling, not the small, high windows of period schoolhouses designed to minimize distraction. These classrooms had maximum natural light exposure. The blueprints even detailed ventilation specifications, industrial-scale air circulation for rooms occupied by, supposedly, 30 to 50 students. The air exchange rates were listed as 8 to 12 times per hour. That's 2.5 times higher than required for normal occupancy. That's what you'd spec for spaces where people are working at maximum exertion, sweating, breathing hard, generating heat. I opened another blueprint. Different city, different year, 1852. Same specifications, suspended floor, same load ratings, iron rings at identical intervals, same ceiling apparatus, same window configuration, same ventilation specs. The labels had changed: municipal education facility, state learning center, but the physical requirements were identical. I started looking at others. The pattern was impossible not to see once I was looking for it. 17 buildings across 7 countries, all built between 1840 and 1890, all labeled as schools. All with identical, unexplainable specifications. All with apparatus attachment points suggesting something other than learning. All with structural engineering that didn't match the stated purpose. The precision bothered me most. These weren't rough approximations. These were detailed engineering documents, calculating apparatus loads, specifying floor impact ratings, designing ventilation for intensive human exertion. The architects and engineers understood exactly what these spaces were for. They included specifications because the specifications were required. But they labeled them as schools. And here's what breaks it: public education didn't exist yet. Not in 1847, not in most of these places. Compulsory, systematic, publicly funded education was decades away. Some of these countries didn't mandate public schooling until the 1880s or 1890s. So who were these facilities training? Who was using apparatus equipped, impact-rated, ventilation-engineered spaces, labeled as schools, before anyone was supposed to have invented the systematic idea of education. Let me show you what I mean by the missing middle. We know schools existed before 1847. That's obvious. Greek academies, medieval monasteries, aristocratic tutoring. But they were sparse, uncoordinated, small-scale, locally organized. Then suddenly, and I mean suddenly, within a compressed timeline of 30 to 50 years, every major city in Western Europe is constructing these enormous, standardized, apparatus-equipped facilities simultaneously. And they're calling them schools, but the specifications suggest they're something else. The coordination problem is what gets you. How do you get architects in Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Paris, London, and Moscow all building to the same specifications at the same time without a documented system, without published standards, without a shared organizing principle? Architecture doesn't work that way. Cities compete. They differ. They have local traditions, local materials, local building codes. But these buildings, from 1840 onwards, are nearly identical in their hidden specifications. The things that don't show, the invisible load ratings. The apparatus anchors nobody would see unless they were looking for them. The blueprint collections are fragmentary. That's another problem. You find one collection in Vienna with 20 buildings documented. You find another in Prague with detailed specifications. You find references in Hungarian archives, Polish records, Romanian surveys, but nobody has ever compiled them together. Nobody has ever mapped the network. The information is scattered across 100 libraries in 100 cities, in archives that aren't digitized, in languages that most researchers don't read. It's as if the documentation was deliberately distributed, fragmented, made difficult to assemble into a coherent picture. The schools themselves are mostly gone now. Some were repurposed into government buildings in the 20th century. Some were converted into factories when industry needed production space. Some were simply demolished, outdated, the records say. Deteriorated, the reports say. Removed. But before they were removed, before they were converted, some of them lasted long enough to be photographed. And those photographs are strange. I found a set of circa 1920 photographs from a facility in Budapest, labeled as a school building from the 1870s. The exterior is modest, nothing remarkable, but the interior. The gymnastics apparatus is visible in some images, not crude, improvised equipment, sophisticated, engineered, heavy iron work. The bars and rings and chains are identical to the ones specified in the blueprints. There's a photograph of a large open space, apparently a main floor, with iron anchor points visible in the ceiling. At least 60 of them, as far as you can see into the photograph. The architect didn't hide them. They're integrated into the ceiling structure. They're part of the design. Here's what the historical record tells you these spaces were supposedly used for: children, learning, reading, mathematics, basic subjects, standard education. But the gymnasium equipment suggests something else. The apparatus suggests conditioning, physical development, systematic training. The specifications suggest military preparation. I'm not saying that's what they were. The records call them schools. The archives label them schools. But I'm asking, why would schools need apparatus engineered for military-grade conditioning? Why would they need floors rated for impact? Why would they need industrial ventilation? Why would they need apparatus configurations that could be reconfigured, modified, adapted? Why would they need to be secret? Because that's the other thing. These specifications, they're not in the main records. They're not in the public building permits. They're in supplemental engineering documents, in archived blueprints, in addendum sections of town records. They're documented, but they're not visible unless you're looking at the original engineering files. Someone built these facilities. Someone designed them precisely. Someone engineered them for purposes that required specific structural capabilities. And then someone labeled them something generic, schools, and scattered the detailed documentation across 100 archives. The timeline is the part that should concern you. The first documented building meeting these specifications appears in 1840. By 1890, there are at least 100 facilities across Europe and Eastern Europe matching the pattern. By 1920, most of them had been either demolished, repurposed, or absorbed into government infrastructure. 50 years of construction, 100 buildings, identical specifications. Simultaneous emergence across multiple countries, no documented coordination, no published standards, no acknowledged organizing system. And then, suddenly, they stop. No new construction after 1895. The existing ones begin to disappear or convert. By 1945, virtually no original examples remain intact. What happened in 1895 that made them unnecessary? What changed in 1920 that made them dispensable? The historical record doesn't address this because the historical record doesn't acknowledge the buildings existed in the first place. They're filed away as schools. Schools are boring. Schools are unremarkable. Nobody asks questions about a 19th century school building because schools are what you'd expect in the 19th century. But these weren't ordinary schools. The specifications don't match ordinary schools. The apparatus doesn't match teaching children to read. The load ratings don't match classroom furniture. The ventilation doesn't match 30 students sitting at desks. Here's what breaks the whole thing open. I found architectural descriptions, actual written descriptions from the period of what these spaces were used for. They're sparse, they're vague, they're not in the main records. But in some archives, tucked into correspondence, mentioned in passing in city council minutes, described in private journals. There are references to these spaces being used for physical conditioning, physical training, physical development of the population. Not education, conditioning. The language changes depending on the country. In some places, the records mention physical culture programs. In others, bodily development initiatives. In Prussia, the description was physical cultivation of national strength. In Austria, public physical conditioning. And these descriptions appear only after the facilities were already built. As if the facilities preceded the official description of their purpose. The sequence is backwards. Usually, you'd expect documentation to come first. You document what you're going to build, explain why, get approval, then build. But here, the facilities appear first. The apparatus is installed. The specifications are engineered. And then, years later, the records start describing what they were supposedly for. The propaganda came after the infrastructure. And here's what should disturb you most. The gap between the stated purpose and the actual purpose is so large that you can drive a narrative through it. These buildings were called schools. They were genuinely used for some educational purposes. They did teach some subjects. Some children probably did learn arithmetic and reading in them, but that was the cover story. The apparatus, the specifications, the load ratings, the ventilation, the apparatus rails, the iron anchor points, those were engineering for something else. Physical preparation. Systematic conditioning. Something that required industrial infrastructure and couldn't be done in ordinary buildings. The gap between schools and what these structures actually were designed for is so vast that you have to ask, what was being hidden? What was so important that it required engineering this precisely, coordinating this extensively, and then obscuring it behind the mundane label of school? The records fragmented. The buildings demolished. The documentation scattered. The purpose rewritten. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't the result of poor record keeping. This was systematic erasure. I don't know what these buildings actually were. I don't know what conditioning program they facilitated. I don't know why every major city in Europe needed one simultaneously. I don't know what happened in 1895 that made them unnecessary, or in 1920 that made them expendable. I don't know why the records were fragmented and scattered. I don't know why the specifications were hidden in addendum documents instead of displayed in primary records. I don't know why the buildings were demolished or repurposed instead of preserved as historical monuments. But I know what the specifications show. I know what the apparatus suggests. I know what the pattern indicates. And I know the official history doesn't answer any of these questions. What I'm showing you is a gap in the historical record, not a conspiracy, a gap. A place where the documented purpose of a building doesn't match its engineered capability. A moment when the official narrative, schools for education, doesn't explain the physical reality, apparatus for conditioning. The gap is what matters. Because gaps in the historical record aren't accidents. Gaps are where important things get buried. And when you find one gap, you start looking for others. When you find the pattern in one country, you start checking others. When you find the evidence fragmented and scattered, you start wondering why someone went to such effort to make sure it wouldn't form a coherent picture. These buildings exist. The specifications are real. The apparatus was engineered. The facilities were built simultaneously across multiple countries by coordinated effort. The only thing that was deleted was the truth about what they were. And if that can happen to an entire infrastructure, if an entire system can be built and then rebranded and then demolished and then deleted from the historical record, what else are we missing? What else is hiding in the gaps between what the official record says and what the physical evidence shows?